Hey everybody, I wanted to get a movie out there for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and hopefully it will help you prepare for the unit test by the end of the week. This video is going to cover the proclamation of Israel, of the State of Israel in 1948. It's going to look at the partitioning of the two separate nations. And it's also going to look at the 6 Days War. A question I'm going to ask will be, why is there terrorism in the Middle East, and possibly how did it come out of this conflict? And why is there anger towards the United States? Is there a possible solution to come up with to resolve this conflict, or where do we go into the future? What do we do? This story begins on May 14, 1948, when the State of Israel was officially announced, establishing the first Jewish state in 2,000 years. On that day, in an afternoon ceremony, the Jewish chairman declared, "We hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel." Immediately following the British Army withdrawal earlier that day, the rumble of guns could be heard from the fighting that broke out between the Jews and the Arabs. That evening, Egypt would launch an air assault against Israel. At the day's end, midnight, the State of Israel officially came into being upon termination of the British mandate in Palestine. The Jews were to possess more than half of Palestine, although they made up less than half of Palestine's population. On May 14th, Britain withdrew following the expiration of its mandate, and the State of Israel was proclaimed. The next day, forces from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded Israel. The next event we will discuss is the partition plan for Palestine, although this event occurred a year prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. Following World War I, Great Britain was given a mandate by the League of Nations to govern Palestine. Jewish immigration to Palestine greatly increased during the 1930s and 40s. Violence erupted between Palestinian Arabs and Jewish people. Unable to resolve the conflict, Britain turned the problem over to the United Nations. The 6-Day War was a brief war that took place between June 5th and June 10th. 1967, and was the third of the Arab-Israeli wars. Egypt had previously come under criticism for failure to aid fellow Arabs against Israel. However, Egypt would demonstrate their support for Syria. On May 14, 1967, Egypt mobilized forces in the Sinai. On May 22nd, he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israel, which essentially instituted an effective blockade on southern Israel. And on May 30th, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo, Egypt, to sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Iraq would shortly join the alliance as well. In response to the apparent mobilization of its surrounding Arab neighbors, early on the morning of June 5th, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed more than 90% of Egypt's total air force. A similar air assault anticipated the Syrian Air Force. Without cover from the air, the Egyptian army was left vulnerable to attack. Within 3 days, the Israelis had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, capturing the Gaza Strip, all of the Sinai Peninsula, up to the east bank of the Suez Canal. The Arab countries' losses in the conflict were disastrous. Egypt's casualties numbered more than 11,000, Jordan more than 6,000, and Syria with 1,000, compared to only 700 casualties for Israel. The Arab armies also suffered crippling losses of weaponry and equipment. The lopsidedness of the defeat demoralized the Arab public. In Israel, it had been proven beyond question that it was the region's preeminent military power. The Six-Day War also marked the start of a new phase in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The conflict created hundreds of thousands of refugees and brought more than 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territories under Israeli rule. The Jewish David had slain the Arab Goliath. Following the 6 Days War and an overwhelming defeat at the hands of the Israelis, the Palestinians and surrounding Arab neighbor allies could no longer compete with the proven dominant Israeli forces. The Arabs resorted to terrorism because they were unable to face the Israelis in conventional warfare. The strategy of terrorism is deliberate attacks on innocent civilians, and it can be traced back to the 6 Days War. Although terrorism did occur prior to the 6 Days War, following it, they felt they were backed into a corner, and this was their last resort. Palestinian and Arab spokesmen commonly claim that the recent Palestinian terrorism is the result of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, adding that the violence will cease only when the occupation is ended. The idea of terrorism can be compared to that of a bully. If a bully is teasing you or even beating you up, and you have no way of reacting or retaliating, because if you do, you will get beat up even more, what do you do? What options do you have? What choice do you make? You have to find new ways of defeating that bully while not fighting face to face. Maybe you start a rumor behind their back. Maybe you attack them when they're not looking. Maybe you go after their friends, civilians. Oftentimes, the anger directed at the Israelis by the Arabs is also pointed towards the U.S. And why is that? The reason for that is because we're considered allies with Israel. We as in America, recognize Israel because they're closer to who we are. In America, the vast majority are Christians, and as is our politicians. So we recognize closely with Israel as opposed to Arab. So that's why a lot of their frustration is taken on America.